Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, Karen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for making time from your home base in Virginia and life on the East Coast of the United States to be joining me today. I'm really, really grateful we can sit down together. And there's so many directions I would love to run in and asking you different questions, but I know that some of the listeners tuning in today have heard a little bit about you or maybe haven't heard anything about you. And for me, being in Christian academic circles and training to be a pastor, I've had the privilege of engaging with a lot of your written work, especially, but would love to give those listeners the chance to hear a little bit of a background to your story, your journey, what got you from where you were as a teenager to where you are today. And so one of the things I know from your story is that as a youth, you actually walked away from your faith for a time. You turned your back on or really had significant questions on what it was to follow Jesus. And I'd love to know what factors actually contributed to that season in your life, because I think many listeners are there of questioning Christianity in big ways, but also what ultimately drew you back to Christianity and to Christ.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I was born into a loving Christian family and received Christ as a very young child and was baptized and grew up in the church, attending church regularly, attending Sunday school and teaching Sunday school. And so I think that, there was a way in which I sort of took my faith for granted. Now I grew up in an area of the country that is by and large secular and not Christian at all. So none of my friends were Christians. I was the only Christian that I knew of in my in my community. But it wasn't like there was peer pressure either way. It was just this was who I was, who my family was, and if my friends slept over, they knew they had to go to church with me. It wasn't really a big deal. I think what was hard for me is that I was an imaginative child. I loved to read. That's mostly what I did is read. And then as I got older, even as a teenager, I loved to read like Stephen King and loved scary movies and loved the life of the mind and the imagination. And I didn't hear from the church any place for those things. The message that I got was more like, the books that I loved, the music that I loved were things I had to hide from the church. And they weren't even necessarily bad. They were just sort of exciting and imaginative. And so, and at the same time, I also heard, again, I don't know that anyone would say that they were intentionally stating this message, but what I heard was that if you really love God, then you will either be a pastor or a missionary. Well, I was Baptist. I wasn't going to be a pastor. And I'm still Baptist, by the way, and I'm still not a pastor.
There you go. Yeah.
But I had no desire to, I remember being told like God might call you to give up everything and move across the world for him to serve him. And that actually kind of scared me. I just wanted to read books and write poems and stories. And nobody told me that I could do that as a Christian. And so when I went to college, majored in English, still had no idea that I could use this passion and this gift to serve the Lord or serve the church, and got into a PhD program. And it wasn't until I was near the end of my program that one of my professors, who was a very wicked and man, I thought, and just he would share sort of shocking ideas in the classroom, to me anyway. And he found out that I was a Christian. Everyone, I was like the Christian in the program, and he started to treat me really respectfully and to say, Karen, as a Christian, what do you think about this? Like in a real, like in an authentically respectful way.
Yeah, like not
And
patronizing.
not at all. Like he
Yeah.
really wanted my view to be heard, not just by him, but by the class. And so I started talking to him after class, and he introduced me to this rich Christian heritage in literature,
Mm,
especially in particular John Milton, the 17th century writer, and his writings on the mind and books and free speech, and he was so respectful, and he just started to teach me these things and treat me respectfully as a Christian, and introduce me to my heritage as a Christian in the field of literature. And by the time I finished my program through this professor and through some other, actually it was one of his classrooms, his classes, I began to realize that not only could I, but I should integrate my understanding of literature and art and beauty with my Christian faith. And I
mm,
realized that, that we are a people of the word. In the beginning was the word was with God, the word was God, that this is the foundation for all literary studies. And this is everything. And so I left my secular liberal PhD program learning more about how to integrate my love of literature with my faith, and everything just that I'd ever been taught. And I, no disrespect to my, the country churches I grew up in, and the humble servant-hearted pastors who taught me. But this is how God used this secular university to
yeah.
teach me, to kind of, through these refining fires, to integrate my life and my faith and my love for literature. And so I went on to serve at Liberty University, which is an evangelical Christian university. Taught English there for 22 years, and then a few years ago transitioned to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I'm really serving the church
Mm,
through teaching English literature and cultural engagement and other related things. And
mm,
God, I mean, I went from thinking I had to choose between God and literature and the life of the mind, and
mm,
I chose. I just said, okay, I'll choose the life of the mind if I can't have both.
mm.
And God used the secular university to show me that I could serve him through this love that he gave me. And so
Yeah.
it's just, he amazes me.
Yeah. Well, and a compelling story. And that was the University of Buffalo. Am I right in
That's
understanding?
correct. Mhm.
Yeah, which is, well, just an aside, I went to school in Houghton, New York, which is just
Oh, yes.
south of
Yes. I
there.
know
So
Houghton.
like
Mhm.
I played the University of Buffalo in soccer a few times, but
Oh,
yeah,
okay. Who
almost a
who
connection
won?
point. You know what? On both
Okay.
occasions we tied.
Oh,
So 1-1 and 0-0.
wow.
So
Wow.
yes,
Wow.
so there you
Small
have it.
world. We have that connection. Yeah.
It's
Western
true,
New
yeah.
York. Yeah.
Thank you, Buffalo. Um, but Karen, I appreciate you sharing that because I know for me in recent years, appreciating that the intersection, if you will, of the good and the true and the beautiful, and seeing how God is inviting us to experience Him and wooing our hearts to Him in those spaces. And I mean, my wife and I right now are reading a book by Gary Thomas called Sacred Pathways, where he's talking about some of the beautiful and diverse ways we're invited to experience God. So I love that your professor, in pointing you to some of the most brilliant minds in church history, was in a way, yeah, propelling you more deeply into that. Now, you've talked a little bit about, you mentioned Liberty earlier, and it's probably one of the most well-known evangelical schools in the world, quite possibly. But I know that historically you've described yourself as Orthodox. That's kind of been your focus term, as opposed to evangelical. And as you and I both know, evangelicals is a word that has some beautiful things and also has some baggage. So could you unpack why you make that differentiation? What you're trying to help communicate to people in describing yourself as an Orthodox Christian?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually use both terms, but
Okay.
Orthodox, and again, this Orthodox is small o, because there are Orthodox denominations with capital O's that,
True.
right. So when I use the term Orthodox, I mean small o, and that term is referring to the church historical for 2000 years, all right?
Mm,
The creeds and the councils and the teachings of the church fathers that I still adhere to. And so that I think that in some ways that term is more helpful and more accurate, because evangelicalism is such a wide umbrella. It was a few years ago, but in the recent years, it's become even more all encompassing. I mean, so you have people who call themselves like progressive evangelicals, and
Mm,
they adhere to ideas that probably, that I would say are not within Orthodox teaching of the church, but they are still consider themselves evangelicals and Christians. And so the terms have some, if we were doing a Venn diagram, there'd be some overlap, but
mm.
and quite a bit of overlap, but also some parts that don't overlap. But I use the term evangelical. Actually, it was in grad school that I discovered I was an evangelical.
Okay.
Because yes, I mean, I knew I was a Christian and I knew I was Baptist, but I didn't really, it was my research, my doctoral dissertation on an 18th century evangelical named Hannah More, who
Mm,
was, she was a good friend of William Wilberforce, who's
hmm
most known for abolishing the slave trade in England. That was where I learned about the historical evangelical movement and its roots
mm.
in the 18th century, which is actually the subject of my book that I just finished, but so that's
Oh,
another
excellent.
topic. But evangelicalism didn't begin in 2016, like the US headlines tend to make us think. Evangelicalism began in the 18th century as kind of an attempt to return what they called to the religion of the heart. In other words, sort of like the importance of everyone having a personal encounter with Christ and
Mm,
having a salvation experience, because at that time, once again in England, it was just because, basically if you were born as an English citizen, you were automatically a member of the
mm.
parish church,
It was a
and you were
cultural Christianity.
yeah,
Mm,
exactly. And you were considered a Christian whether you had joined or not, because you were born into it and you were counted as, as a as a Christian, because there was no separation of church and state. So when we
mm,
say cultural Christianity and we talk about that now, it really did exist at that point. And the evangelicals kind of revived. They're in America, it was called the Great Awakening, the same movements
mhm,
that across the transatlantic. And so I still embrace that evangelical heritage and tradition and
mm,
history,
mm,
but I certainly do understand that it has gained a lot of baggage in recent years. And on the one hand, I'm willing to accept its limitations. On the other, I don't like to, I don't want to see the word, taken from us, because
mm,
there's a global evangelical movement that is
mm,
far bigger and broader than just, American political evangelicalism.
mm. Well said. Well said. And maybe on that front, and I maybe will expose my bias here a little bit, because this is something I've admired from afar, Karen, about you, and especially your interviews you've been a part of, articles you've written, etc., is that you advocate for a traditional view of marriage and are pro-life. And so these are kind of obviously positions that some in the conservative right have historically hyper politicized, said like, this is what we're all about. We have many, 2-issue voters out there, some 1-issue voters out there. And yet at the same time, well, someone could want to just bundle you into the box of, oh, Karen is just, towing a party line. You haven't done that. You've actually been willing to speak out against the stance of the conservative right, at least in recent years, on issues like immigration or race or woman. And that takes a lot of courage, and probably there's some people saying, we thought she was going this way and now she's going this way. And what I see in that is a robust understanding and development of personal conviction, which I think is admirable. And so I want to ask, in the midst of some of these really significant matters, how does your understanding of the kingdom of God actually start to inform the way you hold those convictions on such vital matters, with so much at stake and so many powerful forces engaged in wrestling over them?
Hmm. Whew, we'll start with the light questions, huh?
Sorry.
No,
Now that
no,
we're
no.
3 questions in,
Yeah,
here we go.
yeah. Okay. So it's such a good question. And probably just even in answering it, I'll have to do sort of a lot of soul searching and and searching for the right words too as I articulate this. So I want to begin sort of with a confession. I want to say that for a long time in my life, well, I would say, 10 or 20 years as an adult, I was really into politics, right?
Mm,
I was really energized by the political scene and partisan politics and getting the right presidents in so we could get the right Supreme Court appointees, so we could get the right abortion laws and the right marriage laws and all those things. And that's that. The law is important. If you've read half of what I write, it expresses some sort of articulation of my belief in how the law is a teacher. That's
Mm,
really important. But I've also come to a better understanding of, if something is not true of every believer who has lived in every time and place in church history, whether 2000 years ago in the Middle East or in 1970 in Mexico, if it's not true of every Christian and every believer everywhere, then it's not true of the
mm,
now we do live in culture, we live in communities and time and place, and that does give us a different calling. God puts us in certain times and places, but we really have, I've come to realize we really have to understand our faith in this larger context of the church universal.
mm,
So I say that to say, for example, that well, I, just am so grateful and enamored with the idea that God created us male and female and made us different and complementary, and we have these different capacities and different callings. It's so beautiful because you look around and you see in nature we have light and darkness, we have night and day, we have sun and moon, we have male and female in the animal kingdom. This kinds of dualities and complementariness is all around us, and it's beautiful. It's created by God. And yet somehow, like in the 21st century American church, we have twisted and distorted that design by God into something that's very like American and very, gets down to, to whether women can work or do this kind of job and can't do that kind of job. And like, I just cannot imagine Christians in other parts of the world and other times in history having these debates.
mm,
We can embrace this fullness of our humanity and this imaging of God that we do by being made male and female, and the reflection that we see of that in the natural order, and in the animal kingdom and in the cosmic structures, and yet not get bogged down in the kinds of rules and legalism that isn't binding for all Christians in all time and places. So there's kind of a balance there. I mean, there's beauty there, but it's so easy to mar that beauty with our own narrowness of,
mm.
the narrowness of man.
Yes.
Um, so that's just an example of that, and we've let, to get back to the original. So we have let politics really drive, I think, the kinds of things we say and do and
Mm,
talk about in social media and in the church, because we've let the world sort of dictate the terms,
mm,
rather than letting God's design and plan allowing us to unfold that.
mm.
We're just reacting instead to kind of the politics of the day.
Got you. Yeah. It's almost like whether they say cable news discipleship, and
Oh,
yeah,
mhm,
how it can,
mhm,
yeah, form our
mhm,
perspectives. Well, thank you for that. And thank you. It was
mhm,
almost you can tell that you love poetry and how you answered that question and
mhm,
sharing about that duality. Earlier, Karen, you touched on the fact that you've been a part of Baptist faith communities for most or all of your life, and historically belonged to the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC, which, as we know, is a denomination that, and is not alone in this, but in recent years has grappled with some severe internal issues, and probably foremost among those that people are talking about is that of abuse by church leaders. And that's not unique to that denomination. It's sadly an increasing issue in many denominations. But I wonder, for you as somebody who is a known figure in the SBC, in a time when it might be easy to cut and run, if you will, to say like, oh, well, I'm out, which happens a lot in communities. People just say, I don't want to be associated with that, I'm out. How do you seek to have a redemptive presence, not only for the sake of your denomination, but also the people that are hurting within the denomination?
mhm. No, that's, I mean, I think cutting and running is a temptation some of us face from time to time. And we wake up and say, is it worth it? Do I still want to be here? And it just comes down to, I mean, I'm Baptist by doctrinal conviction.
Hmm.
I in my rebellious young adult Christian years, I did go through membership classes at a conservative Episcopal church. I thought I wanted to be high church, and got all the way through the end of the classes, and and said, no, I'm really Baptist. um, I think the real sticking point in that particular case was assurance of salvation, and
Hmm.
and just and and eternal security. There were some differences there, and I just said, no, I'm Baptist. And so then became Southern Baptist upon moving to the South, which I think was more God's providence than, because I didn't know what I was doing at that time. I didn't, there were all kinds of different Baptists, and I just wanted one that I knew would align with my doctrinal and, to be frank, my political convictions.
Hmm.
But also about biblical inerrancy and so forth, because that was, that's had been a debated issue. Well, it still is.
Hmm.
But so I have my doctrinal convictions, and they align with the Southern Baptist teaching. And even if I didn't have that kind of conviction, because I understand a lot of people, they join a church, they just join a church and find community, and it may not be necessarily based on particular doctrinal nuances, but I look around, like, where am I going to go? As you said, these problems are everywhere.
Hmm.
So if God has placed us, and I believe that he has, then we need to be faithful until he places us elsewhere. I mean, and those things can be hard to determine, but but uh, wherever we are, we have to be faithful, and we have to fight whatever it is that's before us. And so this church abuse issue is everywhere. And it manifests in distinct ways. I mean, it's different in the Southern Baptist Convention than it is in the Catholic Church, because we have different structures. So that means
Hmm.
we have to deal with it in different ways, but it's still there.
Hmm.
And I just, at the end of the day, I want to be counted faithful. And I mean, I'm sure, at a point, any denomination can become so corrupt or so beyond repair that the only faithful thing to do would be to leave. We know that's true through history. There have been breaches and breaks and Protestant
I
reformations.
was just gonna say, we wouldn't be Baptist if
That's
somebody
right.
wasn't
That's
like,
right.
time out. Yeah.
But in terms of the Southern Baptist Convention specifically, we have seen 2 annual meetings in a row, well, sort of annual, COVID interruption, but 2 meetings in a row in which the messengers have overwhelmingly made the decisions that needed to be made,
Hmm.
and have set a course for leadership and a future that I think is grappling with these things. Now it's too slow for some, it's too late, I understand that, but it takes a long time to round a corner, and I think we're rounding that corner. And I think it's worth staying and trying to make a change, because that,
Hmm.
I mean, we're in a time, I think, in church history. I mean, I think we are in possibly a 500-year moment.
Hmm.
Um,
That's a statement. Unpack that. That is so consequential. Yeah. Why would you say
yeah,
that?
I would say that because, and I think I say this sort of in my book that's coming out next year, but so the Protestant Reformation was over doctrine.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, the teachings of the church were so corrupted and so distorted that people just didn't even know, what was true, because they didn't have the Bible to read it. Well,
Hmm.
now we have the Bible to read us, but we're discipled by CNN, as you mentioned before.
Hmm.
So we have the doctrine in front of us, and we can read it whether we do or not. I don't, that's a different story. But I think the 500-year moment we're in now is, how do we apply this?
Yes.
So it's taking us 500 years to say, how do we correctly apply this? And it not just on abortion and marriage. I mean, some of us have that right, but some of us haven't gotten it right on race. I mean,
Mm,
the slave industry and Jim Crow and
mm,
white supremacy were upheld by, Bible reading Christians, professing Christians, right? And
yeah.
so I think maybe we are in a place where we are seeing a refinement of in the church over wholesale, holistic application of the doctrine we now have before us that's a bit clear in God's word to
Mm,
all areas of life, not just our pet ones.
mm. So could you say that's almost like a practical theology? What
Yeah,
how we live out our faith? Yeah.
orthopraxy. The
Excellent.
first
Yeah.
Reformation was over orthodoxy.
Yes.
This one is over orthopraxy, and they really never can be separated. But we've been trying to separate them. So
Mm,
if we are, and I know it's a big if, this is just, and I've had this conversation and people have disagreed with me, but if we are in a 500-year moment, then that means that we who are alive today are in this moment, as opposed is a very, nobody lives
yeah.
for 500 years, right? So
No.
we're called by God to be alive in this moment and to serve the church in this moment. And we might not live. I might not live, maybe you will. I might not live to see this moment through.
Mm,
So I'm doing it for the future. So if it's painful for me now, and it
mm,
is, it's really not
mm,
fun. It's not fun, but I'm not doing this for me.
mm.
Um,
Amen to that. And thank you for your courage to do that, because I'm sure change is painful, and change is painful when you're leading the charge. There's a lot of ways you're leading the charge, Karen. So thank you for that. I wonder, Karen, to pivot a little bit with you. I heard you say in an interview that I listened to recently, you were reflecting on your tenure at Liberty University, which for me in some ways would be just a fascinating place to be. I feel like I learn a lot just by living on campus and taking classes there. And you described the school as a microcosm of the Western Church, which was very, very intriguing for me. And so I wonder, could you unpack that a little bit for listeners? Because I think there's a lot to be learned there.
mm. Yeah. So, I mean, if anyone's familiar with Liberty, it touts itself and I think is really the world's largest evangelical university, right?
Mhm.
And so, of course, the entire Western church isn't evangelical, but let's just, I think all the statistics bear out that evangelicalism within the Western world is sort of the prevailing Christian identity and movement. And
Mhm.
so it it is the major influence. And so Liberty is the world's largest evangelical university, and so therefore it reflects evangelicalism and therefore the Western church in all of its strengths and weaknesses. I mean,
Mm.
I think, it's no secret that especially in more recent years, Liberty took even more of a turn right. Some would say it always was that way. So maybe it was, having been founded by Jerry Falwell, who founded the Moral Majority
Right.
and the
Mhm.
Religious Right. So I guess probably it always was that way. And yet everything gets sort of magnified in this age of social media. And so I think that's its identity, that's its roots. It's become magnified in recent years, and yet you will find among the faculty and students such a wide array of diverse views and even denominational affiliations, and even political parties. I mean, there's certainly a majority, conservative, sort of Republican identified faculty, but you will find others there as well, and you'll find different kinds of student clubs and different activities. And there's this evangelicalism isn't a denomination. It doesn't have confessions or creeds. It's not identified
Mm.
by positions. If you go by the sort of traditional Bebbington quadrilateral defining evangelicalism, then the movement is defined by its central, the Bible being the center, individual conversion, the central place of the atoning sacrifice of Christ, and
Mm.
activism.
Mm.
Those are the 4 points that Bebbington sees in the historical evangelical movement, and that defines liberty. You will find the whole range of Christians, politically, racially, geographically, globally, politically, all of those things are there, although it does by and large sort of lean more white, right, and conservative.
Yeah. And this is just something I'm mildly envious of, but when you can bring in like David Platt or Francis Chan to speak in chapel, that's those are some thoughtful, kingdom-minded voices, which is really a gift too.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I wonder, Karen, I know in reading some of the written work you've done specifically on the article front that you've,
Oh, can I just add one
yeah,
thing?
go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know if you want to edit this or not, but the other thing, Liberty also reflects the larger evangelical movement and the Southern Baptist Convention, because it's also grappling with its own kind of church too and Me Too crisis.
Yes.
And so it really does reflect the larger evangelical movement as a whole.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you for speaking into that. And thank you for the great ways you invested in students for the 2+ decades that you were serving there.
It was
I
a
wonder,
pleasure.
Karen, I know that I've read different articles you've written speaking to the reality and the evidence of, and unfortunately, the influence of Christian nationalism and how that has really been a force in many ways in the West. And I know from, I'm living in Canada at the moment, but went to school in the United States and was interacting with students who are grappling with this. And even now as a pastor, I'm dialoguing with people often on this. But this question of how do we journey with people who've grown up in Christian contexts, faith communities, where Christian nationalism and Orthodox Christian faith have really been kind of dumped in a pot and mixed together. They're kind of blended together, if you will. They really don't see a difference between the two, really a dividing line between one or the other. And so could you speak to how we recognize and confront the unhealthy characteristics of Christian nationalism? And on the flip side, then how we embrace and promote the core characteristics of the kingdom of God?
That is such a good question. And, whether we're Christian nationalists or not, we are creatures of our culture. And it's very hard to see outside our culture. I love to invoke the famous passage from David Foster Wallace in that famous commencement speech he gave a number of years ago, where he tells a story of two goldfish are in a fishbowl, and another goldfish swims by and asks the other two, "How's the water?" And one of them says, "What water?" Right? I mean, that really is the human condition. And so if we live in a white majority culture, we live in America, which I think is a wonderful country that is blessed, and I'm so glad to have been born here. But it's very easy when you are part of that majority to get everything conflated and mixed up. And so going back to what I said earlier, the first thing is to just accept that reality, accept that we are goldfish in water, and it takes work and effort and intentionality to recognize the water, no matter who we are or where we are. That's just true of all human beings. And then secondly, to say, okay, so if I am part of a majority culture, then, just being the majority by its very nature means that the water is even harder for me to see because I'm part of it. And so if we go back to that question that I raised earlier, like, are we doing things that are reflecting things that are true of the church universal? And so are we doing things in our church, for example, that would be strange or even offensive to someone from another place? So if we have an American flag in the church, would that make someone from someplace else in the world who came to visit feel like they were worshiping with the family of God, or were they worshiping with someone who is worshiping a country? I mean, that's just kind of a question to ask, because we wouldn't see a flag. When we're in heaven, we won't see national flags there. And so that's a simple kind of question to ask. But once you begin, I think that the questions can, your eyes can just be open to see things that maybe are just hard to see because we're in that water. And but it begins with just a simple recognition that underlying assumptions are real. We all have underlying assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to interrogate those assumptions, because if we don't interrogate those assumptions, that's when some of us wake up one day and realize or think for the first time about something that undermines everything we believe in. I mean, that,
Mm.
that is happening across the board
Yeah.
to more and more, especially younger generations, because
Yes. Yeah.
we have assumed too much. We need to assume less and ask more.
Mm. Wow. And on that point, Karen, I was interacting with a family member last week who really is in a season, what they would describe as, I think, mass confusion, what maybe some of the academic sphere have described as deconstruction, and just asking those big questions. And in this person's journey, and I think for many, what has started this has been just deep disappointment with hypocrisy in the church, seeing people that have been mistreated by the church, or even instances of abuse by the church. And there's just this deep sense of, I don't know who I can trust, and I don't know what I can believe anymore. And so could you speak to that? What would you say to the person listening who's saying, yes, Karen, like, that is me. I don't know if I should throw everything out. I should know if I should throw some things out. I don't know where to restart. I feel like I'm free falling. How do I move forward in the midst of these tremendous doubts and questions and uncertainties?
Well, this is why, I think it was a year or so ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, I wrote an essay on deconstruction. And
Mm,
I know that's kind of a scary and dirty word to some people, for a number of reasons. But there is, and you can call it other, there are other things. Disentangling is another word that I
mm,
think people use that's maybe less frightening, or interrogating is another word, like to
mm,
interrogate your assumptions. That's a good word. I Again, I think that hypocrisy has always been around, entanglement and mixture of religion and culture have been always been around. But I will just say, I've lived long enough, and I've read enough, and I've seen enough. I'm not, I'm not all knowing, but I really do believe we are in a moment where we're seeing a culmination of this problem
mm,
of too many things being intertwined. So
mm,
if you someone listening is saying that's me, I can't, they're all mixed up, and I'm disappointed, and I'm disoriented. I think many of us are seeing that. I think that the entanglement has been between, the nation and the national religion and Christianity and the church has been going on for so long. It's become so tight. They become so tightly wound together that it was inevitable that they would
mm,
begin unwinding.
mm,
So I want to say, so do the unwinding, but
mm.
do it carefully.
Yeah.
If you're trying to repair, um, in this age of fast fashion, this might be a hard analogy to relate to, but if you have a beautiful, valuable piece of clothing, that you want to repair because it's got loose threads, you do that work carefully, and you take out what's loose or what's rotten or what's torn in a way that doesn't cause more damage to the
Mm,
fabric, and you carefully and lovingly restore those tears, and know that that there is so much repair that needs to be done. But I don't think that, this precious fabric, this precious garment, um, is too damaged to repair.
mm,
Because we're talking about the bride of Christ,
mm,
and she is spotted, and she is blemished, and she is sullied. And we do need to repair, help the Lord, it's the Lord that's doing the repair, and making her spotless. And we just need to let him do that. And the way
mm.
we let him do that, as we're, here still on this earth, is through our faithfulness.
Yeah.
And so, no, you're not crazy. No, it's not just you. This is a time of reckoning. This is a time of revelation, because God is revealing these things that have been under the surface all this time. And sometimes, yes, I would say, oh, it's so hard to see. I almost want to go back to not seeing and not knowing and being, in my illusions, but that's not right either.
Mm,
So we can give thanks that God is revealing these things, and just face these hard truths, um, and be faithful so that God, the Lord, so that Jesus Christ can do his cleaning up of the bride, and we can be part of that.
So that we can be made whole. I
Mm.
wonder, you've used the word faithfulness, and I think it's Andy Crouch who says there's this beautiful opportunity before the church to move beyond consuming
Mm.
or critiquing culture, and I would say even at maybe being conformed to culture, and
Mm.
actually becoming culture makers, and that's Andy Crouch's term. And so I wonder, with that word of faithfulness you used a moment ago in mind, how do Christ followers move in that direction of becoming culture makers?
Mm. Yeah, I love that 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 work by Andy Crouch, and he talks about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that that is what we are called to do, and part of what we are seeing in this moment is that we have been too much of the consumers and the copiers and the critiquers, and not the culture makers. And so the way we do that is, again, I think, to move beyond sort of the partisan and demographic and whatever categories of our particular time and place, and to think about how we can bring those universal, unchanging truths of God and his word and his creation, to shine, to help them shine more brightly in the place where he has put us. And so that will change from place to place. I mean, what looks bright in one area of the world may not look as bright in another. Flannery O'Connor, one of my favorite writers, said famously something, I'm just paraphrasing here, but to the hard of hearing you shout, and to the blind you draw large and startling pictures.
Mm,
um we need to be large and startling pictures of God and his
mm,
truth in our culture, but in a poetic and creative way, not a way that scares and frightens, but that just holds forth his truth in a way that people can recognize. Or as Percy Shelley said, that to lift the veil of familiarity off the world. I mean,
mm,
everything becomes so familiar that we don't see it any longer.
mm,
And so living in a Christian culture, living in a culturally Christian environment, the beautiful truths of Christ can become so familiar that people can't really see them. So we have to
mm,
lift the veil so that they can
mm.
see them.
I love that as an analogy, lift the veil. Well, Karen, we're kind of reaching the end of our time together, but would love, before we land the plane, just to invite you to speak to maybe a handful of some of the great writers and thinkers of the Christian faith that have really most profoundly impacted you, and that in an era when there are tremendous writers and Christian writers and thinkers out there, but also there can sometimes be kind of junk food writing that is frequently consumed in Christian
Okay.
circles. In my opinion, that's my opinion. But what would you say to those listening that you're like, you know what, I would love for you to just deeply engage with some of these thinkers, some of these writers, and
Mm.
here's a few that have really blessed and impacted my life. Who would you point people to?
Well, my roots are in, older and classical literature. So
Mm,
I'll just first mention someone I mentioned earlier in our conversation, who my professor introduced me to, is John Milton,
mm,
who's most famous for his epic poetic retelling of the fall of Adam and Eve in Paradise Lost. But the
mm-hmm,
work that my professor pointed me to, which I think every Christian should read, is a long essay called Areopagitica, which is it's the name from for Mars Hill in the New Testament, but it's where John Milton makes the first modern argument for what in America came to be called free speech.
mm,
It's an important, and he has so much biblical. He's also writing as a Puritan, so there's a lot of
yes,
sort of anti-Catholic sentiment there. So that's because he associates the Catholic Church with censoriousness and inhibitions, and Protestants with
mm,
reading widely, and whether that's right or wrong, that's just where he was coming from. So I would say John Milton. Another, probably one of the most influential Christian writers in my intellectual and spiritual life, is Jonathan Swift, who is an
mm,
18th century Anglican minister, most famous for writing Gulliver's Travels, which is not, if you've only read the children's version, the adult version is very sharp, witty, and satirical. All of his works are satirical. So that would be the work that I would recommend, although he wrote so many other things that are wonderful. And again,
Mm,
I think he influenced me because he was a witty, satirical, devout Christian
mm,
minister.
mm,
Um, and they just don't make them like that anymore.
mm.
Jane Austen is my favorite.
Beautiful for the win. Yes.
Yes, Jane Austen. And if you don't know, Jane Austen was a devout Anglican. Her works are infused with sort of the language of the Book of Common Prayer. She wrote some of her own prayers that still survive to this day. She's basically a virtue ethicist.
Mm,
She writes about virtue in a very old-fashioned way, even
mm,
for the early 19th century when she was writing. And so her, to go back to the goldfish analogy, Christianity and the teachings of the church are the water she swims in. So she might
mm,
not really invoke them explicitly, but they're just there in the water.
mm,
And it's easier to see that now, I think, when we live in a post-Christian culture.
mm.
Um, and let's see, if I can move into the 20th or 21st century. I think that Wendell Berry is a favorite for any who sort
Hmm.
of want to be reconnected to sort of the more natural world and a way of integrating faith with the natural world. And I already mentioned Flannery O'Connor. She is Catholic, but this Baptist loves her. She has a
Mm,
lot to teach Baptist type people like me about
mm,
sacraments and
mm.
an incarnational theology, and about the sort of violent intrusion of God's grace in our lives. She's phenomenal.
I love that phrase, the violent intrusion of God's grace in our lives. You could chew on that for a long time. Well, those are excellent examples. Thank you for sharing those. And and to add into that, you yourself are a published author. And Karen, I mean, you might not be allowed to share yet, but next year you're releasing a book. Are you allowed to tell us what it's
I
called? Is
am
that
allowed to tell you,
Yeah,
yes.
could you highlight that, and also
Yes,
where listeners
sure.
could pick up what you've
Yes,
already
yeah.
published?
So the title is The Evangelical Imagination,
Hmm,
the stories, images, and metaphors that created a culture in crisis.
hmm.
And it's not so much about the imagination as in C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. It's real, although I might mention them. It's about the social. It's really, again, draws on Charles Taylor's idea of the social imaginaries,
Okay.
and how this water that we swim in, I keep coming back to that metaphor, that forms our imaginations at the precognitive level, where we're not even thinking about it, are shaping and informing our visions of the good life and our values in ways that we don't necessarily recognize. And we need to not assume these things, but we need to ask about them and interrogate what our underlying precognitive beliefs
Hmm,
are.
hmm. And for listeners who don't know, Charles Taylor is famous for, what would you say is
Oh,
his?
A Secular Age is his most
Yes,
famous work, right? Yes,
which you
yes.
might, if you're not a mega academic, you might want to read the abridged version, which I forget the philosopher that did one, but Charles Taylor
Oh,
is brilliant.
yeah. James K.A. Smith did sort of an
Yes.
introduction to. Yes.
Thank you, James K. Smith. And quickly, Karen, for people who want to follow you on the socials, where can they find
Yeah,
you?
yeah. Well, probably my most active place is Twitter, which is at KS Pryor. And if you're a more visual person, I do have an Instagram account, Karen Swallow Pryor. But you can find out more about just sort of my works and my links to some of my articles on my website, karenswallowpryor.com.
Excellent. Well, Karen, thank you for the great work you do, the writing that you're continuing to produce, and for making time for today's conversation. I'm really thankful.
Well, it was an invigorating conversation. Thank you for having it.